what I'm trying to say is like you fast forward to the 90s and the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, where I think that the currency of identity, the currency of Indigenous identity in higher education, right? If you mark yourself down as American Indian, then you can get tokenized very easily by academic institutions. You are given benefits, or people who do that see indigeneity as something that gives them access to a certain level of benefits, right? And so this has happened across the, academic institutions, whether it's the recruiting of students at the undergraduate level, or like the kind of like the affirmative action kind of hiring of like Indigenous professor cluster hires that's happened a lot, especially in the last few years in the academy. And typically the people who gravitate, non-native people who gravitate to this kind of like tokenization, are people who understand, because of our political climate of recognition that has happened since trauma kind of entered political discourse, that to tell a story or to portray, to represent one's trauma to an institution of higher education has a type of currency or a benefit attached to it. That's how recognition works. Recognition started with boarding schools, right? The boarding school or residential schools in Canada. And so what are we asking to be recognized by the powers that be? We're asking for our trauma and our pain from colonialism to be recognized. And then they'll apologize for it. Or they'll like hire more of us, or they'll in esteemed academic institutions, or they'll like hire us to head up the Department of the Interior, right? It's the gesture of inclusion that is then seen as kind of like the reparative move by the powers that be. So we demonstrate and we share our trauma, and they're like, I'm so sorry we caused you this trauma. Why don't I hire you into this institution as a form of justice for the trauma? But the performance of trauma is what is expected of Indigenous people. And so Indigenous identity gets attached to trauma, and somehow they're supposed to be interchangeable. And if you hear Marie Cruz's, the way she talks about herself as an Indigenous person, she steals the story of her father. And she says, oh, well, I came from this very abusive, very violent home. I was raised this way. And this is her idea of like what it means to be Indigenous. She even says, she's like, the first time I became an activist was when I had to protect my mom from my father, my violent Indian native father. And so, right, this retelling of trauma, I like this. She's like, this is what it means to be Indigenous, is to grow up in violence and pathology. And if I tell this story and I tell the story to the world, then that's how I'm going to be received. And then she is received, right? She is received, and she is bestowed things because of the story that she tells, the story of trauma. And Joanne Barker talked about this in 2015 when another famous pretendian academic, I worry about saying names of some people because I worry if they're like litigious or something like that. In 2015, when there was an explosive thing after the Rachel Dolezal revelation about the transracial comments came out, I'm pretty sure people listening will know who I'm talking about. But Joanne Barker, that person also had a similar story about extreme violence in like the prior generation or two generations back in their family. And like that moment of violence was a rupture for their indigeneity. So the violence, the Indian people being violent, like in a domestic setting, was what created the context for them not to know who they were as an Indigenous person. And Joanne Barker was like, it's a problem and it's very damaging to associate indigeneity with pathology and with a kind of pathological violence, like we're all just drunks, or like we all rape our children, those kinds of things. And like somehow that's the reason why we get pretendians. It's really icky. Sorry, that was long-winded, but
you never have a pretendian come out and say, I was raised in an upper middle class household in Riverside, California, and my mother was a school teacher and my father was a lawyer. Like, you never hear those stories. You always hear, the drunks, the violence, the domestic violence, or the broken family.
Yeah, the
which
broken
was
family.
the broken family was, was the Rebecca Roanhorse defense. And, um, I, my parents split, I was adopted, and I never had any, um, communication with my mother's family, or whichever, choose one, mother or father, whichever one happened or claimed to be Indigenous. I never had any communication with them. All I know is what I was told, and I was told that they were from X. But I can't. The trauma is preventing me from reaching out to those people,
Right.
so I can't tell you for sure, right? And that's another one of those narratives that we hear all the time. And you know, there is trauma associated
Of
with being
course.
Native, and many of our families, many of our families have these things, domestic violence, alcoholism, whatever. And it doesn't matter what color those families are. I'm talking about anyone in across Turtle Island. I mean, you can't swing a cat and and not, hit someone who has been impacted by alcoholism. It is not an Indian problem. It is not a Native problem.
Yeah.
It is an issue that spans ethnicities and religions, and it is what it is. Domestic violence as well. So why does that have to be something that's always inserted into a narrative of a pretendian? It is, you always hear those things, domestic violence, or broken families or dysfunctional families and alcohol, right? Why don't you ever hear, just, I grew up in a normal family. I was told we were Native, and that, because that doesn't give you the excuse for why you don't know more about
Yep.